think there's a lot of people that could apologise, but apologies work both ways.
What chances do you reckon Meghan of doing that?
Very slim. Slim to none. Let's go with that. Slim to none at this point.
Probably
Unless
right
the
there,
money
Victoria.
runs out.
All right, well, the rift in the royal family is once again in the spotlight with Prince Harry.
When the interviewer pressed to find out who that was, he said he was not prepared to share at this point.
In May 2025, Prince Harry sat down for what seemed like a routine BBC interview, but what came out of his mouth sent shockwaves through Hollywood and exposed one of the biggest lies in modern entertainment history. The Duke of Sussex, speaking candidly about his ongoing security battles, dropped a bombshell that completely contradicts the foundation of his and Meghan's $100 million Netflix empire. Security was made conditional on having that official role, Harry revealed, his voice carrying a tone of genuine frustration. That role that everybody knows that myself and my wife wished to carry on but was stopped from being able to do that back in 2020. Let that sink in for a moment. Harry just admitted they were pushed out. They were stopped. They wanted to stay but couldn't. This is the same man who, along with his wife, built an entire media empire on the narrative of choosing freedom, choosing independence, choosing to step back for their mental health and creative fulfillment. But here's where it gets absolutely explosive. Netflix didn't just hand over a reported $100 to $150 million for any random content creators. They invested in a very specific story. The story of two royals who bravely chose to leave the most powerful monarchy on earth to tell meaningful, uplifting stories that would inspire the world. Ted Sarandos, Netflix's co-CEO, gushed about their authenticity, optimism, and leadership when announcing the deal in September 2020. The streaming giant bought into the fairy tale of voluntary departure, of two people so committed to their values that they walked away from unimaginable privilege to build something better. That narrative was worth every penny of that massive deal, because it promised content with genuine emotional weight. Stories told by people who had sacrificed everything for their principles. Except now we know it was all built on quicksand. Harry's own words reveal that their entire origin story, the very foundation that convinced Netflix executives to write that enormous check, was fundamentally dishonest. They didn't choose to leave. They were forced out. They didn't step back for creative freedom. They were pushed out and then scrambled to rebrand their rejection as liberation. Industry insiders are whispering that this admission changes everything. When you're paying someone 9 figures to create content, authenticity isn't just important, it's everything. Netflix thought they were partnering with brave truth-tellers who had voluntarily walked away from power. Instead, they got bitter ex-employees who were fired and then spent years spinning their termination as a noble choice. Think about every single piece of content Harry and Meghan have created under this Netflix deal. The documentary series, the complaints about privacy, the grievances against the royal family, all of it was presented through the lens of people who chose to leave. But if they were actually pushed out, if they wanted to stay but were stopped, then every single narrative they've sold to Netflix and to the public becomes suspect. This isn't just about changing your story. This is about the fundamental credibility that underpins a $100 million business relationship. Netflix didn't just buy content from Harry and Meghan. They bought their story, their authenticity, their version of events, and now that version has completely crumbled with 6 simple words from Harry himself. We wished to carry on but was stopped. The question now isn't just whether Netflix will renew their deal. It's whether the streaming giant realizes they've been sold a completely false bill of goods from day one. And if that's the case, this BBC interview might just be the moment that brings down the entire Sussex Netflix empire. But that was just the beginning of the unraveling. To understand just how devastating Harry's BBC confession really is, we need to go back to exactly what Harry and Meghan told the world when they first announced their departure from royal life. Because the story they sold in 2020 was carefully crafted, strategically worded, and specifically designed to position them as the heroes of their own narrative. On January 8, 2020, Harry and Meghan released their bombshell statement through their Sussex Royal Instagram account. The language was deliberate, the tone was confident, and the message was crystal clear. They weren't being forced out. They were choosing to step back. After many months of reflection and internal discussions, they wrote, "We have chosen to make a transition this year in starting to carve out a progressive new role within this institution." Notice that word, chosen. Not forced, not pushed, not stopped. They chose this path. They had spent months reflecting, discussing, planning. This was presented as a thoughtful, strategic decision made by two people who wanted to modernize their approach to royal duty while maintaining their commitment to service. But it gets even more calculated. They went on to explain their vision. "We intend to step back as senior members of the royal family and work to become financially independent while continuing to fully support Her Majesty the Queen." They painted a picture of evolution, not exile. They weren't running away from the monarchy. They were reimagining their relationship with it. This narrative was absolutely crucial when they started pitching themselves to Hollywood just months later. Think about it from Netflix's perspective in September 2020. Here were two people who had voluntarily walked away from guaranteed wealth, global platform, and institutional power because they had a vision for something better. They weren't bitter ex-royals nursing grudges. They were innovative leaders who had sacrificed security for authenticity. Their official statement to Netflix doubled down on this positioning. Our lives, both independent of each other and as a couple, have allowed us to understand the power of the human spirit, they declared, through our work with diverse communities and their environments, to shining a light on people and causes around the world. Our focus will be on creating content that informs but also gives hope. Netflix executives weren't just buying content. They were buying into a brand built on voluntary sacrifice, conscious choice, and noble intention. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex had supposedly proven their commitment to their values by giving up everything for them. That kind of authentic conviction doesn't just create compelling content, it creates award-winning content. Ted Sarandos himself emphasized this when announcing the partnership. He praised their authenticity, optimism, and leadership, specifically noting how they had inspired millions of people all around the world. The inspiration, according to Netflix's own press release, came from their courage to choose a different path. But here's what makes Harry's recent BBC admission so absolutely damning. Every single word of that original positioning was based on the idea that they chose to leave, that they spent months planning this transition, that they were carving out a progressive new role because they wanted to, not because they had to. If Harry is now admitting they wanted to stay but were stopped, then their entire Netflix pitch becomes fraudulent. They didn't inspire millions by choosing a difficult path. They were forced down that path and then spent years pretending it was their idea. Netflix thought they were partnering with visionaries. Instead, they got spin doctors, and that distinction might just be worth $100 million in damages. Let's lay out the receipts, shall we? Because when you put Harry's 2025 BBC confessions side by side with their original statements, the contradictions aren't just glaring, they're absolutely explosive. This isn't about slight shifts in narrative or evolving perspectives. This is about fundamental dishonesty that strikes at the heart of their entire media empire. January 8, 2020. Harry and Meghan's official statement. We have chosen to make a transition this year and starting to carve out a progressive new role within this institution. The word chosen appears multiple times throughout their announcement. They had chosen to step back. They had chosen financial independence. They had chosen to split their time between the UK and North America. March 7, 2021. The Oprah interview. Harry tells the world, "My family literally cut me off financially." But even then, he frames this as a consequence of their choice to leave, not as the reason they left. "I've got what my mum left me," he said, positioning their departure as brave and necessary, funded by Diana's legacy. December 8, 2022. Their Netflix documentary series, Harry reflects on the decision. "We never had any intention of making this royal exit." Wait, hold on, that's already a shift from their original chosen narrative. But he continues, "We were forced into this situation." Forced. That doesn't sound like the carefully planned, months-in-the-making strategic decision they described in 2020. But here's where it gets really interesting. Even in their own documentary, they couldn't keep their story straight. Meghan describes feeling unprotected, and Harry talks about how everything that's happened to us was always going to happen to us. They're simultaneously claiming they chose to leave while also suggesting they had no choice. May 15, 2025, the BBC interview that changes everything. Harry's exact words, "Security was made conditional on having that official role. That role that everybody knows that myself and my wife wished to carry on but was stopped from being able to do that back in 2020. Do you see what just happened?" Harry has now completely flipped the script. They didn't choose to leave. They wished to carry on. They wanted to stay in their official roles, but they were stopped. By whom? The royal family. The very institution they've spent 5 years claiming they voluntarily left. This isn't just a contradiction, it's a complete rewrite of history, and it exposes every piece of content they've created for Netflix as fundamentally dishonest. Their documentary series, their interviews, their entire victim narrative, all of it was based on the premise that they chose to leave but were treated unfairly afterward. But if they actually wanted to stay and were pushed out, then their grievances aren't about being misunderstood after making a brave choice. They're about being fired and then having to justify why they were fired. That's a completely different story, and it's not the story Netflix paid for. The timeline reveals something even more damaging. They've been moving gradually from "we chose to leave" in 2020, to "we were forced into this situation" in 2022, to "we were stopped from carrying on" in 2025. Each iteration moves them further away from personal responsibility and deeper into victimhood. But here's what makes this so devastating for Netflix. The streaming giant signed them in September 2020, just 8 months after their chosen departure. Netflix's entire investment was based on the 2020 narrative of voluntary sacrifice for creative vision. They thought they were getting inspirational leaders who had given up everything to tell meaningful stories. Instead, they got people who were apparently fired from their jobs and spent years crafting increasingly elaborate explanations for why it wasn't really their fault. That's not inspirational, that's pathetic, and it certainly isn't worth $100 million. Netflix executives must be looking at this timeline and realizing they've been played from day one. The only question now is whether they'll demand their money back. Now let's dive deep into Harry's latest excuse, because this security narrative he's pushing is perhaps the most revealing part of his entire BBC confession. When Harry claims that security was made conditional on having that official role, he's not just admitting they were pushed out, he's exposing the real reason they've been so desperate to maintain their royal titles and status, even after supposedly choosing freedom. Think about what Harry is actually saying here. He's admitting that their departure wasn't a noble choice based on principles or creative vision. It was a calculated decision based on security concerns. They didn't leave because they had a burning desire to tell uplifting stories through Netflix. They left because they couldn't get the security arrangements they wanted while remaining working royals. But here's where this gets absolutely damaging to their Netflix brand. The security excuse completely undermines every single narrative they've built about wanting privacy, wanting to live normal lives, wanting to step away from the spotlight. If security was such a pressing concern that it forced them to leave their royal roles, then why did they immediately sign deals that would put them in the global spotlight even more than they were before? You can't simultaneously argue that you needed to leave royal life because of security concerns and then sign a $100 million Netflix deal that requires you to share intimate family moments with the entire world. You can't claim that being in the public eye was so dangerous it forced you out of the monarchy and then voluntarily put yourself back in that same public eye for money. The security argument also reveals something much darker about their financial motivations. Harry is essentially admitting that they expected the royal family to continue providing them with taxpayer-funded security even after they chose to step back from their official duties. They wanted all the benefits of royal status, the protection, the prestige, the platform, without any of the responsibilities or oversight. When the royal family quite reasonably said, "If you're not working royals, you don't get working royal security," Harry and Meghan's response wasn't to accept that as fair. Their response was to leave entirely and then spend years complaining about being cut off and pushed out. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too. But Netflix executives should be asking some very pointed questions right now. If Harry and Meghan's entire motivation for leaving was security related, then what exactly were they selling when they pitched their content ideas? Were they honest about the fact that this wasn't really about creative vision or noble principles? Were they upfront about the fact that they were essentially in exile and looking for ways to maintain their lifestyle? Netflix thought they were partnering with principled individuals who had sacrificed everything for their values. Instead, they got people whose primary concern was maintaining their expensive security detail. That's not inspirational storytelling. That's a protection racket. And it's definitely not worth $100 million. While Harry was busy rewriting history in his BBC interview, one person was conspicuously absent from this latest revelation. Meghan Markle, the woman who has never met a microphone she didn't like, suddenly went silent when it came to confirming or denying her husband's bombshell admission. And that strategic silence might be the most calculated move she's made yet. Think about it. For 5 years, Meghan has been the primary architect of their victim narrative. She's the one who sat with Oprah and painted the royal family as cold, racist, and cruel. She's the one who described feeling suicidal and unprotected by the institution. She's the one who turned their departure into a story about a strong woman escaping an oppressive system. But Harry's BBC confession completely undermines Meghan's carefully crafted narrative. If they were stopped from carrying on in their official roles because security was made conditional, then Meghan's entire story about choosing to leave for her mental health and well-being crumbles. You can't be both a victim of institutional racism, who bravely chose freedom, and someone who was pushed out over security arrangements. For Netflix executives watching this unfold, Meghan's silence must be deafening. She's supposed to be their primary content creator, the face of their lifestyle programming, the woman who promised to bring authentic storytelling to their platform. But when her husband contradicts the foundational story of their entire brand, she disappears. Meghan's silence also exposes the careful calculation behind everything she does. While Harry stumbles into admissions that damage their brand, Meghan is smart enough to stay quiet and let him take the heat. She's not going to confirm his story because that would make her complicit in undermining their Netflix narrative, but she's also not going to contradict him because that would expose their marriage as a business arrangement where they can't even coordinate their lies. The most revealing part of Meghan's silence is what it says about their content creation process. If she can't even coordinate with Harry on their basic origin story, how are they supposed to create cohesive, authentic content together? How can Netflix trust them to deliver on promises when they can't even deliver consistent messaging about their own lives? While Harry was busy contradicting 5 years of carefully constructed narratives on BBC, the royal family was doing what they've always done: working, serving, staying silent. and that contrast has never been more stark or more damaging to the Sussex brand. Here's what was happening in the real world. While Harry was rewriting history, King Charles was conducting state visits, managing constitutional duties, and dealing with his own health challenges with dignity. Princess Catherine was launching early childhood initiatives that will impact millions of children. Prince William was addressing homelessness, climate change, and mental health awareness. The working royals weren't responding to Harry's latest contradiction. They weren't issuing statements or calling emergency press conferences. They weren't hiring public relations teams to craft carefully worded rebuttals. They were simply getting on with the job that Harry claims he wanted to keep but was stopped from doing. That silence isn't weakness, it's strength. It's the difference between people who understand their role and people who are still trying to figure out what their purpose is 5 years after leaving. The royal family's response to Harry's BBC admission was the same as their response to the Oprah interview, the Netflix documentary, and every other Sussex revelation: nothing. But that nothing speaks volumes. While Harry was claiming he wanted to carry on in his official role, the institution he left behind was demonstrating exactly what that role looks like. Public service without personal agenda, duty without drama, work without whining about working conditions. For Netflix executives watching this unfold, the contrast must be embarrassing. They invested $100 million in two people who can't stop talking about the job they left, while the people still doing that job never mention them at all. The working royals don't need to defend themselves because their actions speak louder than any statement ever could. This creates a massive perception problem for the Sussex brand. Every time Harry opens his mouth to complain about being pushed out or stopped from carrying on, he reminds the world of what he's not doing. He's not opening hospitals. He's not supporting charities quietly and consistently. He's not showing up for others without making it about himself. The royal family's dignified silence also exposes the fundamental emptiness of the Sussex narrative. If the institution was truly as racist, cruel, and dysfunctional as Harry and Meghan claimed, why is it functioning so effectively without them? If they were such crucial members of the team, why hasn't their absence created any noticeable gap in the monarchy's effectiveness? Netflix should be asking themselves why they invested in people who spent more time talking about their previous employer than building something new. The royal family's silence isn't just dignified, it's strategic. They understand that engaging with every Sussex complaint would only elevate the complainers and diminish their own authority. The moment Harry's BBC confession hit the airwaves, social media exploded, but this time, it wasn't with sympathy or support for the Sussexes. Instead, the public reaction was swift, brutal, and almost universally negative. People who had been willing to give Harry and Meghan the benefit of the doubt for years suddenly saw the contradictions for what they were: lies. Twitter was flooded with side-by-side comparisons of Harry's 2020 statement claiming they had chosen to step back and his 2025 admission that they wished to carry on but was stopped. The hashtag #PickAStory started trending within hours. Users were posting screenshots of their various interviews, highlighting the glaring inconsistencies that had now become impossible to ignore. But it wasn't just regular people calling out the contradictions. Celebrities who had previously stayed neutral or even supportive began speaking up. Piers Morgan, who had been vindicated after walking off Good Morning Britain over Meghan's Oprah claims, didn't hold back. "I said at the time that her story didn't add up. Now we know why. They've been lying from day one." Even more damaging was the reaction from Hollywood insiders. Sources close to Netflix started leaking to trade publications, expressing frustration and embarrassment about being associated with what one executive called a pair of professional victims who can't keep their story straight. The entertainment industry, which thrives on authenticity and narrative coherence, was beginning to distance itself from the Sussex brand. The timing couldn't have been worse for their remaining business ventures. Meghan's With Love Meghan show was already struggling with poor ratings, and her lifestyle brand was facing trademark issues. Harry's BBC admission created a perfect storm that made their credibility crisis impossible to ignore. Industry observers noted that potential partners and advertisers were now questioning whether associating with the Sussexes was worth the reputational risk. But perhaps most tellingly, the reaction from their usual supporters was muted at best. The Sussex Squad, their most devoted online fan base, struggled to defend contradictions this glaring. Their social media accounts, usually quick to attack any criticism of the couple, went largely silent. When your most loyal supporters can't spin your latest revelation, you know you've crossed a line. Harry's BBC admission didn't happen in a vacuum. It came at a time when the Sussex finances are reportedly under unprecedented strain. Multiple sources suggest that the couple's lavish California lifestyle, complete with mortgage payments on their $16 million Montecito mansion, private security costs, and staff salaries, requires millions of dollars annually to maintain. The problem is that their income streams are drying up faster than they can replace them. Spotify terminated their contract early after they failed to deliver promised content. Netflix is reportedly unlikely to renew their deal when it expires, especially after Harry's latest contradiction undermines the entire foundation of their brand. Book publishers are rumored to be reconsidering future projects, given the couple's inability to maintain consistent narratives. Industry insiders suggest that Harry's BBC confession wasn't an accident or a moment of honesty. It was a calculated attempt to shift the narrative in preparation for what many believe will be their next money-making venture, a full reconciliation with the royal family. By admitting they never really wanted to leave, Harry is potentially laying the groundwork for a return that would solve their financial problems overnight. But that strategy reveals just how desperate their situation has become. The same man who spent 5 years building a brand on choosing freedom over duty is now admitting he never wanted freedom in the first place. It's a complete abandonment of the principles that supposedly drove their departure and formed the basis of their Netflix partnership. The financial pressure also explains Meghan's strategic silence. She understands that confirming Harry's version of events would make her complicit in undermining their existing contracts, but she also can't contradict him without exposing their marriage as a business arrangement. So she's staying quiet, protecting her own interests while leaving Harry to deal with the fallout from his admission. For Netflix, this financial desperation should be the final red flag. The streaming giant thought they were partnering with people who had sacrificed financial security for their principles. Instead, they're now dealing with people whose primary concern appears to be maintaining their expensive lifestyle by any means necessary, even if it requires completely rewriting their origin story. The credibility crisis created by Harry's BBC admission represents more than just another public relations disaster for the Sussexes. It represents the complete collapse of the fundamental narrative that has sustained their post-royal careers. You can't build a sustainable brand on constantly shifting stories, and that's exactly what they've been trying to do for 5 years. Think about it from a business perspective. Every successful brand needs a consistent core message, a clear identity that audiences can understand and connect with. The Sussex brand has gone from choosing freedom to forced into exile to we never wanted to leave in the span of 5 years. That's not evolution, it's complete incoherence. For content creators, authenticity isn't just important, it's everything. Audiences can forgive mistakes, they can overlook flaws, but they cannot forgive dishonesty about fundamental facts. When your entire brand is built on your personal story, and that story keeps changing, you lose the one thing that cannot be recovered: trust. The damage extends far beyond their Netflix deal. Future publishers will think twice before investing in memoirs from people who can't maintain consistent narratives about their own lives. Streaming platforms will question whether audiences will believe content from creators whose credibility is shot. Brands will hesitate to partner with people whose own story changes depending on which interview you're watching. But perhaps most damaging is what this says about their judgment and strategic thinking. Professional entertainers and content creators understand the importance of message discipline. They work with teams of publicists and advisors to ensure consistency across all platforms and appearances. The fact that Harry made such a damaging admission suggests either a complete lack of professional support or a willingness to ignore professional advice. Netflix executives must be wondering what other contradictions are waiting to emerge. If Harry and Meghan can't maintain consistency about why they left the royal family, what other aspects of their story might be fabricated or exaggerated? How can a streaming platform build programming around people whose fundamental narratives are unreliable? So here we are, 5 years after Harry and Meghan's dramatic departure from royal life, and the fairy tale has completely unraveled. What began as a story of brave truth-tellers choosing authenticity over duty has been exposed as something much more mundane and disappointing. Two people who got fired from their jobs and spent years crafting increasingly elaborate explanations for why it wasn't their fault. Harry's BBC admission represents the moment when their carefully constructed house of cards finally collapsed. The streaming giant invested $100 million based on a specific narrative, voluntary sacrifice for creative vision. Now they discover that the entire foundation of that investment was built on shifting sand. They thought they were getting inspirational leaders who had given up everything for their principles. Instead, they got people whose story changes every few years depending on what's most convenient. The irony is staggering. Harry and Meghan left the royal family claiming they wanted privacy, authenticity, and creative freedom. 5 years later, they've achieved none of those things. Their privacy is completely gone, having sold their most intimate moments to Netflix. Their authenticity is in ruins, destroyed by their own contradictory statements, and their creative freedom has produced nothing but vanity projects and revenge fantasies that audiences have largely rejected. Meanwhile, the royal family they left behind continues to function exactly as it always has, working quietly, serving others, staying above the fray. The institution that Harry and Meghan painted as dysfunctional and cruel has proven its effectiveness by simply carrying on without them. The monarchy didn't need them. Netflix apparently doesn't need them either. But here's what makes this story so fascinating and so tragic at the same time. Harry and Meghan had every opportunity to build something meaningful in their post-royal lives. They had global platform, unlimited resources, and public goodwill. They could have genuinely changed the world, created content that mattered, shown what modern service looks like outside traditional institutions. Instead, they chose to make every story about themselves, every project about their pain, every interview about their grievances. And now, with Harry's BBC admission, we discover that even those grievances were based on constantly shifting narratives that contradict each other depending on which interview you're watching. The Netflix deal might be officially over, or it might limp along for a few more months, but the real damage is already done. No major platform can build a sustainable partnership around people whose fundamental story changes every few years. The Sussex brand isn't just damaged, it's fundamentally broken, and they have no one to blame but themselves. The question that remains is whether this is truly the end of their media empire, or if they'll find new ways to reinvent their narrative once again. Can two people who've spent 5 years contradicting themselves ever rebuild the trust necessary for a successful entertainment career? And if they can't, what comes next for a couple whose entire post-royal identity has been built on being media personalities? What do you think happens next for Harry and Meghan's crumbling empire? Drop your thoughts below, hit that like button if this breakdown opened your eyes, and make sure you're subscribed because the royal drama never stops, and neither do we. The next explosive revelation could drop any day, and you won't want to miss it.